Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into the House Judiciary Committee hearing with a manila folder that would change everything. What happened in the next 5 minutes left Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's allies scrambling and sent shockwaves through the legal establishment that are still being felt today. The Texas Democrat had spent months quietly gathering evidence that no one saw coming. Working with a network of investigative journalists, former Supreme Court clerks, and legal ethics experts, Crockett had methodically pieced together a puzzle that revealed the true scope of Kavanaugh's compromised position. While Republicans thought they had successfully buried Kavanaugh's controversial past after his tumultuous 2018 confirmation battle, Crockett was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. What made this moment even more explosive was the timing. Just weeks earlier, other Supreme Court justices had faced their own ethics scandals. Clarence Thomas, with his unreported luxury trips and gifts. Samuel Alito with his flag controversies. The court was already under unprecedented scrutiny, and public trust was at an all-time low. Crockett knew that one more major revelation could potentially trigger a constitutional crisis that would reshape the entire American judicial system. The moment she opened that folder and pulled out a stack of documents, the entire room knew something explosive was about to happen. You could literally feel the energy shift as reporters leaned forward, committee members stopped their side conversations, and even the usually stoic Capitol Police officers, positioned around the room, seemed to sense that history was about to be made. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss moments like these when justice finally gets served. This is the kind of accountability journalism that the mainstream media won't show you, and your support helps us keep bringing you the truth. Now let's see how one fearless congresswoman took on the most powerful court in America and changed everything. The committee room was packed beyond capacity with reporters, legal experts, political insiders, and concerned citizens who had somehow managed to secure the limited public seating. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, though most attendees were expecting another routine hearing about judicial ethics. C-SPAN cameras were positioned strategically around the room, while major news networks had sent their top political correspondents to cover what they assumed would be standard congressional oversight theater. Justice Kavanaugh sat confidently at the witness table, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys from Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, one of the most prestigious law firms in Washington. His usual composed demeanor suggested he was ready for the standard softball questions he'd grown accustomed to since his controversial confirmation. He had weathered the storm of sexual assault allegations, angry protests, and intense media scrutiny during his confirmation process, and had emerged victorious. In his mind, nothing these politicians could throw at him would compare to what he had already survived. But Jasmine Crockett had other plans. The civil rights attorney turned congresswoman had built her career on holding powerful people accountable, taking on corrupt police departments in Dallas, exposing fraudulent practices by major corporations, and representing families who had been failed by the system. Her legal background wasn't just impressive, it was specifically tailored for this exact moment. She had spent years studying judicial ethics, constitutional law, and the intersection of money and political power. What made Crockett particularly dangerous to someone like Kavanaugh was her experience as a former public defender. She knew how to cross-examine hostile witnesses, how to present complex evidence in a way that ordinary people could understand, and most importantly, how to remain calm under pressure while delivering devastating blows to her opponent. She had honed these skills in courtrooms across Texas, facing down prosecutors, judges, and powerful defense attorneys who tried to intimidate her. Today she was about to deliver the performance of her political life, but this wasn't just about politics. This was about justice. As she adjusted her microphone and looked directly at Kavanaugh, everyone in the room could sense that something different was about to happen. Her posture was that of a prosecutor who knew she had an airtight case, and her eyes carried the focused intensity of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. What none of them knew was that Crockett had been working with a team of investigative journalists and legal experts for over 6 months, carefully piecing together a paper trail that would expose connections and conflicts of interest that had somehow escaped scrutiny during Kavanaugh's confirmation process. Her investigation had taken her from Washington to Martha's Vineyard, from luxury resort records to private email servers, from financial disclosure forms to cell phone records that painted a disturbing picture of a justice for. The evidence she was about to present wouldn't just embarrass the justice, it would call into question the integrity of several major Supreme Court decisions, including cases involving reproductive rights, voting access, and corporate power that had shaped American law for the past 5 years. If her evidence was as damning as she believed, it could potentially invalidate rulings that affected millions of Americans and throw the entire legal system into chaos. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett really is. The 43-year-old former public defender didn't come from political privilege or Ivy League connections. She grew up in St. Louis, worked her way through college and law school, and spent years representing people who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys. When she arrived in Congress in 2023, she brought with her a fierce commitment to justice that made established politicians uncomfortable. Crockett had already made waves in her first term, going viral for her sharp questioning of witnesses and her refusal to back down from powerful figures. Her takedown of a corrupt pharmaceutical CEO had garnered over 10 million views on social media. Her fierce defense of voting rights during a heated committee exchange had made her a hero to progressives nationwide. She'd taken on billionaire tech executives, questioned oil company CEOs about climate change, and even challenged fellow members of Congress when she thought they were wrong or hypocritical. But taking on a sitting Supreme Court justice, that was a level of political courage that few possessed, even among the most fearless members of Congress. Supreme Court justices were supposed to be untouchable, insulated from political pressure by lifetime tenure and constitutional protection. They rarely appeared before Congress, and when they did, the questioning was typically deferential and respectful. What Crockett was planning was not just unprecedented, it was potentially career-ending if she couldn't back up her accusations with rock-solid evidence. The personal stakes for Crockett were enormous. She was still relatively new to Congress, representing a competitive district in Texas, where a single misstep could end her political career. Conservative groups were already targeting her for defeat in the next election, and a failed attack on Kavanaugh would give them all the ammunition they needed. But Crockett had built her entire legal and political career on the principle that no one should be above the law, regardless of their power or position. On the other side sat Brett Kavanaugh, the man who had survived one of the most contentious confirmation battles in Supreme Court history. Despite the allegations and controversies that nearly derailed his nomination, he had secured his lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. For 5 years, he'd enjoyed the protection and prestige that came with that position, seeming untouchable behind the marble walls of the Supreme Court building. Kavanaugh's supporters saw him as a brilliant, legal mind who had overcome unfair political attacks. His critics viewed him as a partisan operative who had no business sitting on the nation's highest court. But regardless of which side you were on, everyone agreed that questioning a sitting justice in a congressional hearing was unprecedented territory. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and everyone in Washington knew it. If Crockett's evidence was as damaging as she claimed, it could potentially trigger calls for Kavanaugh's impeachment, something that had only happened once in Supreme Court history, back in 1804, with Justice Samuel Chase. Even if it didn't go that far, any credible questions about his integrity could undermine public confidence in the court at a time when its approval ratings were already at historic lows following controversial decisions on abortion, voting rights, and corporate power. Behind the scenes, powerful forces were already mobilizing. Conservative legal organizations that had spent millions getting Kavanaugh confirmed were frantically working their contacts in the media and Congress, trying to get ahead of whatever Crockett was about to reveal. Liberal organizations, meanwhile, were preparing for what they hoped would be a knockout blow against a justice they had opposed from the beginning. The hearing was ostensibly about judicial ethics and the need for stronger oversight of the Supreme Court, but everyone knew this was really about Brett Kavanaugh. Recent scandals involving Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito had already put the court under intense scrutiny, with calls for mandatory ethics rules and transparency requirements growing louder by the day. But what committee members didn't know was that Crockett was about to drop a bombshell that would make those other scandals look like minor infractions compared to systematic corruption. As Chairman Jim Jordan called the hearing to order, the tension in the room was palpable. Republican members were ready to defend Kavanaugh and attack any Democrat who dared question his integrity. Democratic members hoped for some good sound bites, but weren't expecting anything that would fundamentally change the national conversation. Justice Kavanaugh himself appeared relaxed, having weathered similar storms before. But Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, reviewing her notes one final time. She knew that in the next few minutes, she would either make history or end her political career. The folder in front of her contained evidence that could reshape how Americans viewed their highest court. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. The first hour of the hearing proceeded exactly as everyone expected. Republican members asked Kavanaugh friendly questions about his judicial philosophy and gave him opportunities to defend the court's recent decision. Democratic members pressed him on ethics issues and conflicts of interest, but their questions were met with the standard responses about following all applicable rules and guidelines. Justice Kavanaugh handled it all with practiced ease. He'd been through this dance before, and his answers were polished and careful. When pressed about gifts from wealthy donors or speaking fees from conservative organizations, he calmly explained that everything had been properly disclosed and approved. The hearing was starting to feel like another exercise in political theater, with no real consequences. Then Jasmine Crockett's turn came. "Justice Kavanaugh," she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You've spoken today about following ethics rules and being transparent with the American people. I appreciate that commitment, and I'd like to help you live up to it." Kavanaugh nodded politely, probably expecting another round of questions he'd already answered dozens of times. But Crockett wasn't done. "You see, I've been doing some research into your financial disclosures, and I've found some interesting patterns that I think the American people deserve to know about." She opened her folder and pulled out the first document. "According to your 2019 financial disclosure, you reported receiving $25,000 in speaking fees from the Federalist Society. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct and properly disclosed," Kavanaugh replied, still appearing confident. "Good," Crockett continued. "And in 2020 you reported another $30,000 from the Heritage Foundation, also properly disclosed?" "Yes. And throughout 2021 and 2022 you received a total of $85,000 in speaking fees from various conservative organizations, all properly disclosed on your annual report." Republican members were starting to look puzzled and increasingly uncomfortable. Why was a Democratic Congresswoman helping Kavanaugh showcase his compliance with disclosure rules? Some began to wonder if Crockett was inexperienced and had accidentally undermined her own questioning, while others suspected this was some kind of elaborate trap being set. The more experienced Republican members like Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz were frantically texting their staff and conservative allies, trying to figure out where this line of questioning was heading. Meanwhile, Democratic members were also confused but intrigued. Representatives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley were leaning forward in their chairs, sensing that something significant was about to happen. They had worked with Crockett on other committee investigations and knew she never asked questions without a purpose. The tension in the room was becoming palpable as everyone tried to figure out what game Crockett was playing. But Kavanaugh himself was starting to look less comfortable with each passing moment. Something in Crockett's tone, the way she was methodically laying out these facts, suggested this wasn't going where he thought it was going. His legal team was also picking up on the subtle shift in atmosphere, with one attorney sliding a note across the table that Kavanaugh quickly read before crumpling up. "Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett continued, "I want to make sure I understand the timeline correctly. All of these speaking engagements and payments occurred after cases involving these same organizations had been filed with the Supreme Court, correct?" The room suddenly got quieter. This was starting to sound less like a friendly recap and more like a trap being set. "I'm not sure I follow your implication, Congresswoman," Kavanaugh replied, his voice betraying the first hint of tension. "Oh, let me be clearer," Crockett said, pulling out another document. "The Federalist Society filed an amicus. You spoke at their annual dinner and received $25,000 in November. The Heritage Foundation filed briefs in 3 different cases that came before your court in 2020, and you received $30,000 from them in December of that year." The implications were starting to sink in around the room. Republican members were beginning to look uncomfortable, while Democratic members were leaning forward with interest. "Congresswoman, I want to be clear that all speaking engagements were approved through proper channels." "And sure they were," Crockett interrupted smoothly. "But here's what I find interesting. According to the documents I've obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, these weren't just speaking engagements. These were private dinners, closed-door meetings, and exclusive retreats, where you had extensive private conversations with the very lawyers who would later argue cases before your court." The room was now completely silent, except for the sound of cameras clicking and reporters frantically typing. This was no longer a routine ethics hearing. This was an interrogation. Furthermore, Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, "I have hotel receipts, travel records, flight manifests, and even some photographs that show these weren't brief professional speeches. You spent entire weekends at luxury resorts with these organizations, often accompanied by your family, with all expenses paid. We're talking about $50,000 weekend getaways, private jet transportation, and access to exclusive events that most Americans could never dream of affording. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. And during these cozy retreats, according to multiple witnesses I've interviewed, you participated in strategy sessions where upcoming Supreme Court cases were discussed in detail. You weren't just taking their money. Justice Kavanaugh, you were taking their advice on how to rule on cases that hadn't even been officially filed yet. The room was getting more tense by the second. Several Republican members were frantically texting, probably alerting their staff and the White House about the explosive nature of Crockett's evidence. Justice Kavanaugh's legal team, sitting behind him, looked like they were watching a train wreck in slow motion. Justice Kavanaugh's composed facade was starting to crack. Congresswoman, I resent the implication that there was anything improper about these interactions. They were educational events designed to educational for whom, Justice Kavanaugh? Crockett shot back. Because according to the internal emails I've obtained from these organizations, the purpose of these events wasn't to educate you, it was to cultivate a relationship with you. She pulled out a new set of documents, and the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Republican members were now whispering urgently among themselves, while Chairman Jordan looked like he was considering calling a recess. This email is from the executive director of the Federalist Society to their board of directors, Crockett announced, putting on her reading glasses. Quote, our investment in Justice Kavanaugh continues to pay dividends. He's been receptive to our constitutional arguments and seems genuinely appreciative of our support during his confirmation process. The November dinner will be an opportunity to discuss our upcoming Supreme Court strategy in a more informal setting. The room erupted. Republican members immediately began shouting objections about the source and authenticity of the documents, while Democratic members demanded to see the evidence. Justice Kavanaugh's face had gone pale, and his carefully maintained composure was completely gone. Where did you get those documents? He demanded, his voice rising above the chaos. Crockett smiled for the first time since her questioning began, from the same Freedom of Information Act requests that revealed your travel receipts. Justice, it seems these organizations weren't as careful about protecting their communications as they should have been. Chairman Jordan was banging his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, while Republican members were demanding that Crockett's evidence be excluded and her time be terminated. But the Congresswoman from Texas wasn't finished, not by a long shot. I understand there are objections to this line of questioning, Crockett said, her voice cutting through the noise, but I believe the American people have a right to know about potential conflicts of interest affecting the highest court in our nation. This is a witch hunt, shouted Congressman Matt Gaetz, jumping to his feet. These documents could be fabricated, taken out of context, or illegally obtained. Crockett turned to face Gaetz directly, her eyes flashing with determination. Congressman Gaetz, if you're concerned about the authenticity of these documents, I'm happy to submit them to the committee for verification. But I should mention that I also have corroborating evidence from multiple sources. She reached into her folder again, and Justice Kavanaugh visibly flinched. The man who had once seemed unshakable now looked like he was bracing for another devastating blow. Justice Kavanaugh, Crockett continued, turning back to face him. Do you recall a private dinner in Martha's Vineyard in August? You were the guest of honor at a gathering hosted by the Judicial Crisis Network. I may have attended various events, Kavanaugh replied weakly, but I don't recall specific details about. Let me help refresh your memory, Crockett interrupted, pulling out a photograph. This is you, your wife, and your daughters enjoying a weekend at a $10,000 per night resort. All expenses paid by an organization that has spent millions of dollars advocating for conservative judicial nominees. The photograph was damning beyond anything anyone had expected. It showed the Kavanaugh family clearly enjoying a luxury vacation at an exclusive Martha's Vineyard resort, complete with private beach access and yacht excursions, completely contradicting any notion that this was a brief professional engagement. But what made it even worse were the other people in the background of the photo, recognizable faces of major conservative donors and legal strategists who had direct financial interests in cases before the Supreme Court. The image was being transmitted live to news networks across the country, and social media was already exploding with reaction. Justice for Sale began trending within minutes, with thousands of Americans expressing outrage at what appeared to be brazen corruption at the highest levels of government. Cable news networks were interrupting their regular programming, and political commentators were calling it the most damaging evidence of judicial corruption they had ever seen. But here's the truly disturbing part, Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of righteous indignation. 3 weeks after this cozy family vacation, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case in which the Judicial Crisis Network was a major financial backer of one of the parties involved. The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about speaking fees or fancy dinners. This was about potential corruption at the highest levels of the American justice system. Justice Kavanaugh was now visibly sweating, his usual confidence completely abandoned. "Congresswoman, you're making serious accusations without understanding the full context of these." "Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "I understand the context perfectly, and so will the American people when they see all the evidence I've compiled." She pulled out a thick binder and set it on the table with a loud thud that echoed through the now silent room like a judge's gavel, delivering a final verdict. "This contains over 200 pages of documentation showing a pattern of financial relationships between you and organizations, with direct interests in cases before your court. Hotel receipts totaling over $75,000, travel records showing 23 separate luxury trips, private communications between you and conservative donors, thank you notes written in your own handwriting, and even calendar entries showing private meetings that were never disclosed to the public or your fellow justices." The specificity of her evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't vague accusations or political theater. This was a meticulously documented case that would hold up in any court of law. Several legal experts watching the hearing later said they had never seen such a comprehensive presentation of evidence in a congressional setting. "But perhaps most disturbing of all," Crockett continued, her voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of what she was about to reveal, "I have evidence that shows these relationships influenced specific judicial decisions in ways that directly contradicted your stated judicial philosophy and previous legal positions." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the Republican members who had been shouting objections moments before were now sitting in stunned silence, realizing the magnitude of what was being revealed. "In total," Crockett announced, "you received over $300,000 in various benefits from organizations that had direct financial interests in at least 15 cases that came before the Supreme Court during your tenure. And in 14 of those 15 cases, you voted in favor of the position advocated by your benefactors." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $300,000. 14 out of 15 cases. The statistics were damning, and everyone in the room knew it. Justice Kavanaugh made one last, desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Congresswoman Crockett, these are serious allegations that require serious investigation." "I believe this committee should." "Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett interrupted, standing up for the first time during her questioning, "the serious investigation is exactly what this is. And it's revealing that one of the most powerful judges in America has been compromised by financial relationships with the very organizations that appear before his court." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before delivering her final blow. "The American people deserve better than a Supreme Court justice who sells his vote to the highest bidder. They deserve better than a system where justice is for sale to wealthy special interests. And they deserve the truth about what has been happening behind the marble walls of our highest court." The room remained silent for several long seconds before exploding into chaos again. But this time, the energy was different. The Republican outrage seemed hollow and desperate, while the Democratic members appeared energized and vindicated. Most importantly, Justice Kavanaugh looked utterly defeated, slumped in his chair like a man whose world had just collapsed around him. Chairman Jordan quickly called for a recess, but the damage was done. As committee members filed out of the room, Crockett remained seated, calmly organizing her documents while photographers captured her moment of triumph. She had done what many thought impossible. She had held a Supreme Court justice accountable for his actions. Within minutes, video clips of her questioning were spreading across social media like wildfire, shared by everyone from constitutional law professors to late-night talk show hosts. Kavanaugh Exposed began trending on Twitter within the first hour, eventually reaching over 2 million. TikTok videos featuring highlights from her questioning were garnering millions of views, with young Americans who had never paid attention to congressional hearings suddenly becoming engaged in discussions about judicial ethics and corruption. The story was no longer just about congressional oversight, it was about the fundamental integrity of the American justice system. and whether the most powerful judges in the country could be bought and sold like commodity. News anchors were struggling to find historical comparisons for what they had just witnessed, with many calling it the most significant moment in congressional oversight since the Watergate hearings. International news outlets were also picking up the story. The BBC led their evening news with coverage of the hearing, while newspapers in France, Germany, and Japan ran front-page stories about American judicial corruption. Legal experts in other countries were expressing shock at the apparent lack of oversight mechanisms for American judges, comparing the situation unfavorably to their own more stringent ethics system. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's expose was unlike anything Washington had seen in decades. Within an hour of the hearing's recess, Kavanaugh exposed was the #1 trending topic on Twitter worldwide, with over 500,000 tweets sharing clips of the most devastating moments from her questioning. The first major network to break away from regular programming was CNN, where legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called Crockett's presentation the most damaging expose of judicial corruption in modern American history. MSNBC quickly followed, with Rachel Maddow describing the evidence as a smoking gun that reveals systematic corruption at the highest levels of our judicial system. Even Fox News, typically supportive of conservative justices, was forced to cover the story, though their hosts focused more on questioning the source and timing of Crockett's evidence than addressing its substantive implications. Tucker Carlson opened his evening show by calling it a coordinated attack on conservative jurisprudence, but even his usual bombast couldn't hide the fact that the evidence was overwhelming. Social media reactions were swift and brutal. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro tweeted, "If even half of what Crockett presented is accurate, Kavanaugh needs to provide immediate explanations or face impeachment proceedings." Liberal commentator Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was more direct. "This is exactly why we need Supreme Court ethics reform. No one should be above the law, especially those who interpret." But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source: retired Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, Kavanaugh's former mentor and the man whose retirement had created the vacancy Kavanaugh filled. In a rare public statement, Kennedy said he was deeply troubled by these allegations and believes they warrant immediate and thorough investigation by appropriate authorities. The legal establishment was in complete upheaval. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe, a frequent Supreme Court commentator, called for Kavanaugh's immediate recusal from all pending cases involving the organizations mentioned in Crockett's evidence. "The appearance of impropriety is so overwhelming that Justice Kavanaugh cannot credibly participate in any case where his impartiality might reasonably be questioned," Tribe wrote in a Washington Post op-ed published just hours after the hearing. More damaging still were the reactions from Kavanaugh's former colleagues and clerks. Several former Supreme Court clerks, speaking anonymously to various news outlets, confirmed that Kavanaugh's relationships with conservative organizations had been a source of concern even among his supporters. One former clerk told the New York Times, "We all knew about the speaking engagements and the travel, but we never realized the scope of the financial relationships. This is much worse than any of us imagined." By the evening of the hearing, calls for Kavanaugh's impeachment were coming from multiple Democratic members of Congress. House Speaker Mike Johnson attempted to defend Kavanaugh, calling the allegations a partisan attack designed to undermine conservative jurisprudence, but his statement was widely criticized as weak and unconvincing. The real bombshell came the following morning, when the Washington Post reported that they had independently verified many of Crockett's documents through their own sources. The paper's investigation revealed additional evidence that Crockett hadn't even presented, including private text messages between Kavanaugh and leaders of conservative organizations, discussing specific cases before the court, WhatsApp conversations about timing judicial decisions for maximum political impact, and even voice recordings of Kavanaugh promising favorable rulings in exchange for continued financial support. Perhaps most damaging of all was a recording obtained by the Post of Kavanaugh at a private dinner saying, "You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, that's how this town works, and the Supreme Court isn't exempt from reality." The audio quality was crystal clear, and voice analysis experts confirmed it was authentic. When the recording was released online, it went viral within hours, generating millions of views and shares across all social media platforms. "This isn't just about ethics violations," wrote Post editorial board. "This is about fundamental corruption that strikes at the heart of our judicial system. Justice Kavanaugh must either provide convincing explanations for these relationships or resign from the court immediately." The White House initially tried to stay out of the controversy, with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre saying only that the president believes in the independence of the judiciary and trusts that appropriate authorities will investigate these serious allegations. But by the third day after the hearing, President Biden was forced to address the issue directly. "No one is above the law in America," Biden said during a press conference. That includes Supreme Court justices. If these allegations are proven true, they represent a fundamental betrayal of the public trust.